Emily has never been an adventurer, but the loneliness that settled into her life after the divorce forced her to try something new. Colleagues at work had long advised her to register on a dating site, where many found their love or at least company for dinner. After much thought, she finally made up her mind by uploading some of her old photos and writing a couple of lines in the questionnaire about her love of traveling and good coffee. The first person who caught her attention was John. He looked like a calm and confident man, whose messages were friendly but not too intrusive. After a couple of weeks of correspondence, they agreed to meet at a local cafe located near her house. Against the background of this date, Emily's life continued to flow in the usual rhythm. Her work in the clinical laboratory of a local hospital did not leave time for her personal life. Frequent night shifts, the smell of disinfectants and the cold light of fluorescent lamps have long been part of her daily routine. The hospital seemed to be a separate world with its own rules and laws, in which there was a place not only for patients, but also for dark secrets. One of these incidents occurred a couple of weeks before her meeting with John. An undocumented man appeared in the emergency room, claiming that someone was following him. His whisper and haunted look aroused the curiosity of the entire shift, but the strangest thing began later. A few hours after his admission, he simply disappeared, leaving behind only an overturned gurney and several bloody bandages in the ward. The surveillance cameras did not record anything unusual, which gave rise to even more rumors among the staff. But at work, Emily tried not to think about the oddities. She controlled herself, because her new life began with this date. John offered to pick her up by car, but she insisted on meeting him at a cafe. This place was located in a busy part of the city, which added to the sense of security. The evening of the meeting came. Emily chose a simple but elegant dress and, looking in the mirror, tried to convince herself that everything would be fine. The cafe was almost empty when she went inside. John was already waiting for her at a table by the window. He was taller than she had expected, with a slight streak of gray at his temples that added to his solidity. They spent a pleasant hour discussing movies, work, and future plans. But something about his behavior made her a little uneasy. Sometimes he spoke in too general phrases, as if he was trying to avoid specifics about himself. "Did you come by car?" he asked towards the end of the meeting. Emily replied that her car had broken down and she planned to call a taxi. John offered her a ride, and after a moment's hesitation, she agreed. As soon as they hit the highway, Emily began to notice the oddities. John drove confidently, but his gaze was too focused, as if he avoided looking at her. The tension grew when he turned off the usual route, explaining that it would be faster this way. Meanwhile, at the hospital where Emily worked, there was talk of a missing man. One of the staff claimed to have seen him in the basement of the old building. This building has not been used for a long time, but sometimes homeless people got there. Shortly after this message, disturbing messages began to arrive from security guards about strange noises coming from the basement. Meanwhile, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake by getting into John's car. The highway was getting more and more deserted, and she couldn't tell where he was taking her. "Are we really going there?" she asked cautiously. John shot her a quick glance, but didn't answer. The events of the previous month, the mysterious disappearances, the fear that increasingly gripped her at work and outside the hospital, all seemed to be woven into a single knot. And now she felt like she was becoming a part of something terrible. Her thoughts were interrupted by the headlights of another car flashing in the distance. John abruptly turned aside, saying that he knew a shortcut through a country road. She was panicking now. When the car stopped at a sagging building in the middle of the forest, Emily realized that she had to do something. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest as the car stopped on the gravel driveway in front of the building. In the headlights, she could see the dilapidated facade, the windows of which were boarded up. No signs of life. Just a thick silence. John turned off the engine and turned to her. His gaze was strange, assessing. "Wait here, I'll just check something inside," he said with such calm confidence that it made it even scarier. He got out of the car, slamming the door. Emily rushed to her phone to call for help, but there was no network. It's too far from the city. It's too isolated. Footsteps sounded outside, but it wasn't John. She quickly bent lower to hide behind the dashboard. Through the fogged up window, she noticed a figure-8 short man in shabby clothes, who was slowly walking towards the car. Emily froze. The stranger stopped abruptly in front of the driver's side door. He tried to open it, but the door was blocked. His hands, dirty and bloody, began to drum on the glass. John's footsteps sounded behind him. He was shouting, "Damn it, you should have stayed there." His voice sounded angry, as if he was fighting with someone. Emily took advantage of the moment to jump into the driver's seat. She tried to start the car, but there were no keys. The decision came suddenly. She opened the glove compartment, hoping to find something useful. There was a bunch of old wires lying there. Maybe it was a chance. The footsteps were getting closer, and now she could hear John cursing loudly. He had a desperate, almost panicked tone. It gave her some time. She quickly twisted the wires, trying to close the ignition. Sparks flashed, and the engine rumbled. Emily slammed on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, leaving behind screams and the sound of gravel flying from under the wheels. She didn't know where to go, but she knew one thing: she needed to get out of here as quickly as possible. After a few kilometers, she saw a sign pointing to the nearest town. The road was getting smoother, and she was relieved. But not for long. She saw the headlights in the rearview mirror. Someone was following her. She reached the hospital, barely managing to slow down at the entrance. Emily abandoned the car in the parking lot and stormed inside. She hoped that they would help her here. But something was wrong. The reception area was strangely empty. The lights were flashing, but there was no one at the reception desk. "Hey! Is anyone here?" Her voice echoed through the halls. There was no response. Just a creepy feeling that someone was watching her. She ran to her department, hoping to find her colleagues. But what she saw made her freeze. There was a note on the floor, stained with blood. It read, "You know more than you should. They're coming for you." Emily grabbed the note and looked around. The door to the old hospital building, which was considered abandoned, was ajar. There was a faint creaking sound coming from behind it, as if someone was trying to get out quietly. She knew it was a risk to leave alone, but curiosity welled up inside her. All the staff couldn't just disappear. Maybe there was a clue explaining everything that was going on. Emily approached the door slowly, clutching a heavy metal flashlight tightly in her hands. The old building looked even darker than she had imagined. Long corridors, peeling paint on the walls and cracked tiles on the floor. Half-broken wheelchairs lined the walls. She heard a rustle from around the corner and froze. It could have been John. Or someone else. Emily stepped forward, straining her ears. The rustling became louder. She raised the flashlight, illuminating the path ahead of her. Suddenly, a silhouette appeared out of the darkness. It was the same man who had recently been seen in the hospital. His eyes were bloodshot, and his arms were stretched out as if he wanted to say something. "Please help." His voice was weak, almost a whisper. But before she could respond, he fell to the floor, followed by quick footsteps in the darkness. She rushed back to the exit, but realized that the way was blocked. Emily slowly retreated, feeling the sweat trickle down her forehead. Fear froze her movements, but she couldn't allow herself to stop. In front of her lay the man who had recently been seen in the hospital, and behind him, heavy footsteps could be heard from the dark corridor. The sounds were getting closer. She turned abruptly and ran in the opposite direction, trying not to trip over the debris scattered on the floor. Looking at her hands, she realized that she was still holding the bloody note. "You know more than you should." My thoughts were confused, but one thing was clear: this is not an accident. Everything that is happening is connected with the hospital, with John, with the fact that she got into this abandoned building. She saw a fire exit around the corner. The rust-covered metal door was slightly ajar. She rushed to it, but as soon as she tried to push it, the door wouldn't budge. There was an old but strong lock on it. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Emily began to look around for something to break the lock with. There was a fire shield on the wall, and a small axe lay behind the glass. She grabbed the metal frame and hit the glass with all her might. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the hallway. Grabbing the axe, she swung it and hit the lock. One punch, two. The lock loosened, but did not budge. The footsteps stopped behind her. She turned and froze. John was standing in front of her. His clothes were dirty, his hair was disheveled, and he was holding a long steel pipe in his hand. "You're too nosy, Emily," he said with a cold grin. "I told you to just sit in the car." She didn't answer. All her attention was focused on the castle. She punched again, and finally, the lock flew off the door. John stepped closer, lifting the tube. Emily abruptly pushed open the door and ran outside. The fresh air burned her lungs, but she couldn't stop. She ran along the wall of the building, dodging piles of garbage and old construction equipment. There were quick footsteps behind him. John was catching up with her. Running out to the road, she stopped and tried to catch at least one car. But the highway was empty. Only a few headlights flashed in the distance. She saw the light of a flashlight ahead and ran towards it. It was a security guard from the hospital who was patrolling the area. When he saw her in such a state, he hurried to meet her. "What happened?" "What is it?" he asked, but Emily didn't have time to answer. John came around the corner of the building. He still had the pipe in his hand. The guard, not understanding what was happening, turned to him. John acted with lightning speed. The blow landed right on the guard's head. He fell to the ground without making a sound. Emily ran on, but her strength was running out. Her legs took her back to the hospital, but now to the central building. Still empty, it seemed to her a little safer than the street. She went into one of the offices and locked the door. There was a computer in the office. Emily turned it on, hoping to call for help or at least understand what was going on here. Files with the hospital's internal documentation were open on the desktop. Among them, she found a list of patients and reports of strange experiments. It turned out that illegal research had been conducted at the hospital for several months. Patients from the street were used to test new drugs. Most of them died, but those who survived suffered from serious mental disorders. The man she had seen earlier was one of those test subjects. Her gaze caught on one name on the list, John McCarthy. He was a participant in the experiment and was also supposed to die. But somehow he had escaped death and was now connected to these events. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Light, slow strokes. Emily froze, clutching the axe she was still holding. "Emily, open up. You've already realized that you have nowhere to go," John's voice rang out. She didn't answer. Her hands were shaking. "You've seen what's going on. The hospital doesn't belong to you and your colleagues for a long time. This place is just a screen. We're doing what needs to be done." Emily realized that he wasn't going to leave. She abruptly opened the window, which was located directly behind the table. It was the second floor, but she had no choice. She climbed out and jumped onto the lawn. Pain shot through her legs, but she was able to get up. Despair gripped her. The hospital building towered behind her like a huge monolith, hiding many secrets. She knew she couldn't go back there anymore. Her footsteps took her to the road, where she finally saw the car. It was an ambulance that was returning after a call. Emily ran out onto the road, waving her arms. The driver stopped, but looked wary. "Please take me to the police station," she begged. "Terrible things are happening here." The driver nodded curtly. When she got into the car and the door slammed shut, her heart finally slowed down. She tried to explain everything that had happened, but the driver was silent. It wasn't until a couple of minutes later that she noticed that there was no name or hospital logo on his uniform. He looked at her through the rearview mirror and said, "You shouldn't have meddled with your own business, Emily." Her scream was drowned out by the sound of the ambulance doors closing. Emily froze in place, realizing that she had made a huge mistake. The man behind the wheel looked calm, but his words sounded like a death sentence. She looked at the car doors. They were locked. "Who are you?" Her voice was shaking, but she tried to hold on. The man only smiled slightly and looked in the mirror again. "Just a driver who will take you where you belong." Emily frantically searched for a way out. Her hands found something under the seat. It turned out to be a medical briefcase. She opened it and found a set of syringes, some of which were already filled with clear liquid. "Don't touch it," the driver said, his voice strained. Emily didn't listen. She grabbed one of the syringes and squeezed it in her hand. "Stop the car or I'll hit you." The man looked at her with narrowed eyes. The car continued to move along the deserted road. The forest belt was dark outside the windows. "You don't know what's in there," he said, pointing to the syringe. Her fingers tightened. "Then stop it. Now." The man chuckled slightly and slammed on the brakes. Emily was thrown forward, the syringe slipped out of her hands and fell to the floor. The driver immediately turned around, grabbed her arm and tried to pull her out of the car. But Emily wasn't going to give up. She kicked him, opening the door lock, and climbed out. The man followed her, but she was already running towards the forest. The forest was dense, cold, and covered with a thin layer of fog. Emily stumbled over tree roots, trying to get as far away from the road as possible. Heavy footsteps could be heard behind them, but gradually they subsided. Pausing to catch her breath, she looked around. The darkness was almost absolute, with only a faint moonlight filtering through the treetops. In the distance, she noticed a faint flicker of lights. Thinking it might be a house or a campground, she headed there. The closer she got, the clearer it became that this was a small camp. A man, who looked like an ordinary tourist, was sitting by the campfire. "Help me!" she screamed, running out of the forest. The man by the campfire turned around and immediately jumped to his feet. "What happened? Are you okay?" Emily recounted everything that had happened, stumbling and gasping for breath. The man looked puzzled, but seemed to believe her. "Okay, calm down. I'll help you. There is a hunting base nearby, where you can hide and call the police." Emily felt relieved. The man put out the fire, took a flashlight and led her along the path. As they approached the base, she noticed that the building looked abandoned. Doors creaked, windows were smashed. "Is it safe?" "What is it?" she asked, looking around. "No one lives here, but I'm sure there must be a connection." He pointed to the radio station on the table in the corner. Emily rushed to it, turned it on, but all she heard was static. "It's broken," she whispered. The man looked at her and then at the window. "We have a problem." She turned around and saw several people approaching the building. There was an ambulance driver among them. "They found us," the man said. "Hide." Emily ran up the stairs to the second floor, trying to find shelter. She ran into one of the rooms, closed the door and propped it with a chair. There were screams and bangs outside. The pounding downstairs stopped, but then footsteps could be heard coming up the stairs. She noticed another note on the table. It said, "They always know where you are." A cold dread gripped her. She realized that everything that was happening was not accidental. This is an organized group that uses people for its own purposes. The footsteps were getting closer. She pressed herself against the wall, holding a wooden chair leg in her hands. The door began to slowly open. The door creaked as the unknown man began to come inside. Emily froze, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. In the moonlight, she saw a hand reaching out to open the door even more. At that moment, her adrenaline took over. She slammed the wooden leg of the chair sharply against her arm. There was a thud and a strangled cry of pain. The man staggered back, stumbled and fell. Emily looked out of the room. She saw that it was a stranger, not an ambulance driver. The man was holding onto his broken arm, his face contorted in pain. You don't know where you're in," he croaked. She wasn't interested in his words. Emily ran out of the room, brushed past him, and went downstairs. Everything on the ground floor was smashed. The front door was open, but there were no more people in sight. She jumped out, looking around. There were no sounds. No footsteps, no voices. She needed to get as far away from this place as possible. She decided not to return to the road, but to go deeper into the forest, hoping to find help. The trees were getting thicker and thicker, the light of the lantern hardly penetrated through the dense crowns. The silence was eerie, with only her footsteps and rapid breathing filling the air with sounds. It seemed like several hours had passed when she reached the old railway line. It looked like a rescue. The rails led somewhere, perhaps to a station or at least to a work settlement. She walked along the tracks, trying not to make too much noise. Suddenly, she heard a faint metallic sound. She turned around, but saw nothing. The steps became faster. The sound was repeated, closer this time. It was the clang of metal, like a screech. Suddenly, lights appeared behind them. Emily turned around, expecting to see a train. But the light didn't come any closer. Instead, she realized that they were lanterns, in the hands of people. "Stop," a voice called from afar. She took off running across the tracks. Branches whipped at his face, and his lungs burned from lack of oxygen. Soon she was back at the wooden building. It was a guardhouse, obviously long abandoned. She ran inside and tried to close the door, but the lock was broken. The booth was filled with old tools and iron parts. She found a heavy pipe and decided to use it for protection. Outside, the footsteps grew louder. Emily pressed herself against the wall, waiting for them to enter. Suddenly, a voice rang out. "We know you're here. Come out." She was silent, trying to figure out how to get out. "We just want to talk. Don't force us to use force." The word sounded strange, almost polite. She realized that their game was manipulation. Emily realized that she had been betrayed. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the walls of the warehouse. Her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed like it would deafen her before anyone else could. She darted behind the nearest crate, trying to hide in the shadows. Her eyes frantically searched for something to use for protection. Nothing. There's only dust and old wooden boxes around, which won't help against those who clearly outnumber her. The voices were getting closer, the voices were getting closer. "We know you're here. Don't hide, it only delays the inevitable," one of the men said. Emily quietly retreated to the other side of the warehouse, trying not to make a sound. But her foot got caught on a metal bar. He hit the concrete floor with a thud. There was a loud shout. Emily jerked toward the door, which she hoped would lead her outside. She opened it with force and ran into a long narrow corridor. The footsteps of the pursuers were very close. The corridor seemed endless. The peeling paint walls pressed down on her. There was another door at the end, this time with a heavy iron lock. She gripped the door handle, turning it with all her strength. But the door wouldn't budge. "Well, did you get caught?" The voice sounded right behind her. Emily turned around. The man standing in front of her was the ambulance driver. His face was expressionless. He looked at her with absolute confidence. She darted to the side, but he caught her by the arm and roughly pulled her to him. "You knew it was useless." She struggled, screamed, but his grip was too strong. He dragged her back to the warehouse. The others were already waiting there. Emily was dragged into the central hall of the building. Strange tools were laid out on the floor, soldering irons, pliers, even an old cutter. "It will be our last copy this week," the driver said. "We'll finish it quickly if he doesn't resist," another added. She understood that her life now depended only on her cunning. "Wait! Stop it," she shouted, hoping to gain at least a minute. The men stopped. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know who I am." "We don't care who you are," the driver replied, getting down on one knee in front of her. "You're just a number. Just like everyone else before you." He opened one of the drawers, took out a thick folder and showed her some photos. They showed the terrified faces of other people. They all looked the way she did now, scared, helpless. "This is an archive. Everyone who passes through us stays here in our collection." Her eyes darted around the room. She was looking for something she could use, but all the items were out of reach. "We'll start with something light," one of them said, picking up a soldering iron. Emily screamed, but no one heard. No one came. The sound of pain, her own screams, and the smell of burnt skin filled the air. Her consciousness began to fade. "Hey, you're losing her," one of the men said. "She can handle it. We need to finish everything." They continued until her body stopped showing signs of life. The next day, her remains were thrown into an unnamed forest. Her personal belongings were burned, and no one remembered her name. To those who hunted her that night, she was just part of the game. And when the police found her remains months later, it became another unsolved story. The ambulance continued its work, tracking down new customers.